Welcome to the show. Today's guest is Bobby Jamieson. He's the senior pastor of Trinity Baptist Church in North Carolina, and he's also got his PhD in New Testament, and he's also going to be talking a little bit about his new book, which I thought was really helpful. Everything is Never Enough, Ecclesiastes Surprising Path to Resilient Happiness. Great title there, and Bobby, just looking forward to having a good chat. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, brother.
One of the things that was fascinating for me, and we talked a little bit off camera, just how, I got a chance to go to a weekender over COVID, one of the unmasked weekenders at Capitol Hill Baptist, which was quite the experience and a pretty crazy time. But it was really cool to see just the vision of ministry, the passion for the local church, the importance of the local church laid out at that weekender. And it was really cool, hearing you talk a little bit about your own journey in the world of academics and in the pastoral world, and how you're kind of a little bit of both. And so I'm just curious, just starting off, can you tell a little bit about your story and how what was the process like going into academics, wanting to get your degree in theology, and then how did ministry kind of weave its way into that?
Sure, yeah. Well, my prehistory is that I was pursuing a career in jazz saxophone. I did a music degree as my undergrad at USC. But during my college years, the word really started getting a hold of me. The local church really started getting a hold of me. And I began to have a desire to pursue pastoral ministry starting in college. And by God's grace, I got some good ministry experience through my church's campus ministry in particular, preaching and teaching on campus, doing evangelism, leading small groups. And so by the end of my undergrad years, I finished out the music degree, but it was kind of like, okay, I'm either going to be all in as a musician, I need to stick with that, or I need to be all in on something else because I don't have the kind of degree I can just go out and get a job and buy time. And, So I did, from the time I graduated college, I was actively pursuing being a pastor of a church. But I knew, I'm 21, I'm a fresh college grad. I know there might be a long time between pursuing it and it actually becoming realized and being called as a pastor. But also from those earliest kind of inklings of a desire to do ministry, I did have I've always been nerdy. I've always been bookish. I've always read. I didn't even know that the whole kind of world of theology existed until I was introduced to it through a more kind of reformed Bible teaching church in college. Having that desire to do ministry woven in with that was some sense of just wanting to serve the broader church through writing and teaching if I could. And, I kind of got a head start on some of it through studying Greek as an undergrad, just on the side. I started getting interested in reading more New Testament stuff. And so even kind of a specialty in New Testament started to kind of appeal to me. But also a more theological. I was reading some of the stuff on theological interpretation. I was reading some more historical sources in theology. So I guess I started to have a little bit more of those developed academic interests, even at kind of a young stage, an early stage. But for me, the desire has always been consistent to be primarily a local church pastor, and to try to be useful to the church in other ways. And frankly, to kind of learn things, grow, sort of scratch an intellectual itch, but to try to do it in a way that'll benefit other people. And so I did have a desire to pursue a PhD, along with wanting to be a pastor from a pretty early stage, being influenced by kind of other brothers who were more sort of pastor theologians. I don't think that's a typical path. I don't think that's a necessary path. I did have some mentors, though, guys like Mark Dever, Michael Lawrence, brothers who had done PhDs and gone into the pastorate. And there are pros and cons. I don't think it's a typical pathway again. But the Lord was kind to sort of give me good counselors. So just to kind of fast forward, then what's the story look like? Pursuing pastoral ministry all along. I interned at Capitol Hill Baptist Church right out of college, stuck around and had the privilege of working for 9 Marks in a kind of entry-level editorial way for a couple of years. Got to keep that job and do it remotely while I went to seminary at Southern in Louisville for 4 years. And that was with the intent of going on and doing a PhD. And the Lord is very kind to open up a door to go to Cambridge. So I studied with Simon Gathercole. We moved from Louisville to Cambridge with our family, lived there for 3 years, worked at Tyndale House, which is the world's greatest place to do a PhD in biblical studies. Every book you need, every source you need is in the building and cannot leave. You have this wonderful community of evangelical scholars from all different countries, all different traditions, but they're all committed to the Bible. So you have, if you need to do some reading in Rabbinic Hebrew and your Rabbinic Hebrew is not very good, there's a guy who can just read Rabbinic Hebrew in his sleep and he can kind of walk you through it and show you what's going on in the Talmud. And, hey, Kim Phillips, can you help me? I need to read this treatise on the atonement. How are they reading Leviticus 17:11? And how does that relate to Hebrews? Tyndale House is amazing. And so my family had a great time in Cambridge. It was an immense privilege. But again, I was doing that to try to get more of the equipping for the overflow ministry / cross training / whatever else the Lord would enable me to do. And then we returned to Capitol Hill Baptist in 2017 for me to be an associate pastor there, and kind of the next main preacher, teacher, staff leader after Mark. And then we served 7 years there. And I wound up planting a church just not quite a year ago in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, called Trinity Baptist Church. So we've been here almost a year, and the church covenanted about 8-9 months ago. And I guess
great. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I guess just to maybe flesh it out a little bit more, the Lord's been kind to give me some opportunities to teach in various seminary contexts and do some writing on the side as well, which I would say is a gracious fulfillment of those desires, to be mainly a pastor, primarily a pastor, but to have some of those other things going on the side.
So, I don't know how many biblical or New Testament scholars start off as saxophone musicians. That's a pretty
Con
cool.
Campbell, he still is, but anyways.
That's true. I you know what? That's funny. I think I saw like a video on YouTube. I'm like, is that the guy?
He's ripping it up. He's a bodybuilder, jazz saxophonist, and New Testament scholar. So
wow, that's the new Renaissance man, I guess. Yeah. But so you really started off being like you want to be a local church pastor guy. But what was it about? Because not every pastor goes beyond his MDiv and gets a PhD. Yeah. What was it about the PhD that really drew you in? Was it just what are some considerations you had about that? And maybe even looking back, or, if you're going to advise somebody about it, what are some things to consider?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's kind of a personal side and a vocational side. The vocational side is a little bit more concrete, even though I didn't intend for it to necessarily open a door to a different primary vocation. It is a calling card for being able to teach in a formal institution, and for many types of writing. To have a PhD is kind of a baseline, ticket of entry to certain conversations. So one criterion, if you mainly want to be a pastor, but you're thinking about a PhD, is what kind of other stuff are you doing already? Maybe adjunct teaching or teaching in other kind of formal or informal contexts, or writing. Are you writing for publication? Are you already doing that kind of stuff that would be served by having that credential? And I, by God's grace, I was. Some of the writing through 9 marks. I was doing a little bit of kind of TA type work when I was at Southern, teaching, filling in for teaching in the undergrad classes and stuff like that. And I mean, certainly you want to filter all this through godly counsel in the local church of people who know you well, and ideally people who have that experience kind of bridging the pastor-scholar divide, whether they're seminary professors who also have pastoral experience, or pastors maybe who have more academic training. Certainly seek a lot of counsel. Because again, I don't think it's a typical pattern. I don't think it's just, I love to read. I seem to have some intellectual gifts. I should just go on and do a PhD. There can be a huge opportunity cost, huge cost on your family. And frankly, there are many institutions graduating many PhD graduates that is frankly kind of a glut for the market, so that if you think you're just going to get a PhD and go get a seminary job, that's like 99% out of 100 not going to happen. There are gifted guys out there who should do that and will do that. But 99% of PhD grads, even from evangelical institutions, are just not going to get a full-time seminary job. So that was never my goal. Although in God's providence, if he ever sort of redirected me into that, I'd be open to doing that. It's a noble vocation. I love the seminary professors I had, and I enjoy the classroom. So yeah, I guess that's more the vocational side. The personal side, I enjoy in-depth exegesis. I enjoy the kind of rough and tumble of wrestling as hard and deep as I can, kind of over a difficult text, maybe with, competing arguments, competing readings. That kind of gets my blood pumping intellectually. And so I think for me, it was partly being drawn to the discipline, just the in-depth exegesis of New Testament studies. And, in conversation with Simon Gathercole, even from the application process, he was very kind and accommodating about thinking about, since I mainly want to be a pastor, I should really try to find a topic that'll get me doing a lot of exegesis. Not just like reading Josephus in Greek for 3 years for some kind of historical background point that relates to this one teeny tiny part of the Gospels. And so I worked on Hebrews, and I worked on atonement in Hebrews. And so it was a deeply exegetical PhD. So I guess just the rigor of trying to look as hard and deep as I can at some deep issues in a rich book, and be pushed by trying to kind of make and answer scholarly arguments, that, kind of is intriguing and engaging to me. And I think it's filtered into my teaching. I think it's beefed up the amount of sort of cubic centimeters of my exegetical engine for teaching and preaching. But I wouldn't say that the ways it's grown me as a teacher and preacher would justify the time, the hassle, the expense, all that kind of stuff, sort of just as a pastor. Is that helpful?
Yeah. I mean, do you think that, because you mentioned the discipline and the rigor. First, I'm curious if your music background actually prepared you for some of that rigor.
I think so. I mean, you have to memorize a lot. You have to figure out how to kind of assimilate something and kind of study it and sort of climb the mountain of whatever the challenge of the piece or the technique or whatever it is. I do think, there's a lot of musicians who train at a high level and then kind of pivot to something else. And insofar as music is is a language, I think it also set me up for languages well. So I kind of transferred some of that energy from music to Greek. I'm like a moderate level Greek geek. There's people I studied with, guys like Daniel Stevens or others who are teaching elsewhere. Will Ross. I mean, I know some real hardcore Greek geeks who run circles around me, but I'm at least a moderate level sort of Greek geek. It always appealed to me.
But you were saying that I have some friends who done different PhD programs. One of the things they talk about is the emotional toll. It can be a very lonely process.
Yes.
And you have to basically hammer away at this one kind of little thing and try to make a little tiny contribution
totally.
And sustain focus.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think that doesn't overlap all that much with normal pastoral gifts in terms of abilities as a teacher, kind of studying the word and teaching publicly, and the kind of character of counseling, shepherding. It's a weird skill set. And even people who really have the skill set, can really struggle with it interpersonally, emotionally. It's a weird, lonely task. And that's partly just the way the modern academy is built, that you have to assimilate all the previous research, make some allegedly fresh argument, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It forces you to go super narrow, super deep. And I suppose that type of work, I'm just wired weird. It appeals to me. I like to kind of try to find an issue like that to break off. And so my experience was that it was pretty enjoyable. Tedious, yes. There's elements of it that are super tedious. But I kind of enjoyed the sort of brick by brick, step by step aspect of the work. And it probably helped too that I had some background in writing through the work with 9 Marks, because one pastors should be able to communicate clearly, but there are plenty of pastors who can communicate clearly. Maybe they put bullet points down and have an outline for their preaching, and they get into the pulpit and they're super fluent. That's a kind of communication gift that is perfectly satisfactory for the pulpit. It's very different than the sort of clinical clarity of being on the blank page. And not only that, but the sort of technical clarity for academic writing. So I think some of the work I'd done editing and writing for 9 Marks probably helped with that too. And so I guess I would say, a big question is your sort of facility as a writer would also be a question to be asking if you're thinking, I want to be a pastor, I'm thinking about a PhD. Yeah, how good of a writer are you? Is a good question to ask.
I remember one of my professors, and I know Greg Lanier.
What a beast.
Yeah, what a beast, right? And
a godly man, devoted to the church. I mean, Greg's great.
But also a beast, right? Yeah. He wrote an article about like why you should go to seminary, because there's like 5,000 articles on why like seminary destroys your soul, and it's pastors learn nothing there anyway. And but one of the things, and this is what I found true in my seminary education, and was there is something sanctifying about writing something and someone who's way smarter than you being like, that's incorrect. Seeing the red marks on your papers is actually because it forces you to be like, oh, I'm not just shooting from the hip. Like, I've got to really work to rightly divide the word of truth. And that is a rigorous process.
Yeah. And I do think that formal seminary training should involve some of that work of synthesizing, articulating, writing more of a position paper, a thesis style paper, and having your thought exposed to that level of searching scrutiny, where you're learning the kind of building blocks of evidence, argument, proof, refutation. For my money, I wish seminary classes did a lot more of that, because I think the kind of basics of making an argument, on an exegetical subject, a theological subject, historical, all those different disciplines that feed into pastoral work. I wish seminaries did more of that. And it could be at the essay level.
Yeah.
5 pages, 10 pages, 15 pages, 20 pages. It doesn't have to be some massive term paper. But I think the analytical clarity and argument, that totally feeds in as the kind of scaffolding for a solid, persuasive, teaching-based, but moving on to application and exhortation kind of sermon. I think if seminaries did more of that, maybe fewer guys would feel the need to kind of go into a PhD to just feel like, oh, I've kind of got this unmet intellectual hunger.
Yeah.
So that is kind of an argument, not that anybody cares what I think, but that is kind of an argument for more rigorous MDiv education and a more rigorous sort of argumentative, rhetorical, logical, having to produce that type of work in your MDiv. Certainly, if you have a good PhD advisor, and I mean, different disciplines are a little bit different, but I think you can get a higher level version of that in the PhD. I sure did. I mean, I learned all kinds of things from Simon about the shape of an argument, the burden of proof. What are you arguing, and have you offered enough evidence to justify this conclusion? I got a lot of that from Simon, and he's amazingly sort of intellectually virtuous and rigorous and humble. So that certainly helped me and paid off for me. But I think there is a way more of that could just get incorporated into an MDiv.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's
study with Greg Lanier and it will.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But that is what I appreciated. I went to RTS Orlando, and it was that was what I appreciated. They really pushed you to be rigorous and to think things through. And if it didn't make sense what you were saying, they'd be like, I have no idea what you're saying, which is actually a helpful thing to have. I mean, I'm thinking about I think most pastors, especially, Reformed, evangelical, pastors, we enjoy reading. We like theology, but there's just so much you got to do. You got meetings with people, you got counseling situations, you got all these types of things. And how is your academic training helped, or how is the rigorous study and research and kind of the intellectual mind you developed as you were doing your PhD, how is that shifted as you're now a senior pastor and you're planting a church? How do you, what does it look like to do research now? What does it look like to do reading and thinking? How do you kind of fit that in? Because you can't devote as much time as you did when you were at Cambridge, or was it Cambridge? Yeah.
It was Cambridge, and then, Capitol Hill for 7 years. A few different things. I mean, my kind of work week is overwhelmingly given to stuff that's directly relevant to my local church. And I do think healthy habits of study for sermon prep and that kind of thing are, feed my soul, keep me sharp, but it's not excessive. I don't think I'm doing more or doing stuff that's much different. Maybe I will squeeze in a little bit of occasional extra reading. That might be a little bit hard for another pastor to do, but maybe some New Testament scholarship or a beefier book on a challenging issue or a hard passage. I might squeeze in a little bit of extra reading. Here's a really good published monograph on Romans 7. What do I think about Romans 7? Well, I'll just go plow through the whole thing before I have to teach it. I'll do a little bit of that. But otherwise, I think my sermon prep is fairly normal or replicable. Or, I think one thing for me is it's in some ways a hobby or an avocation or a complementary kind of thing that I find it restful to chew on hard stuff to read in my free time. And so I'm not necessarily recommending that to pastors. I think some element of just a healthy reading diet to stay sharp and grow in other areas, I think as a general practice, that's good for pastors. Keep getting sharpened on different theological issues, different biblical subjects. My kind of outside reading projects often have a little more of a focus to sort of turn into a book eventually. So that's, I guess, my main way of primarily giving myself to pastoral ministry, but having some type of scholarly or semi-scholarly output from time to time is reading in my free time, taking notes, and often when I get a sabbatical, devoting that to writing. So it's not so much on a day by day or week by week basis as it is kind of storing up, thinking, taking notes, and turning that into a project on a sabbatical. Yeah,
where does saxophone time get squeezed
now
in?
That since it's not the thing I'm doing anymore, it's kind of hard for it to be a thing. So no, much more of my time is given to caring for my family, looking after my kids, spending time with them. Yeah, it's mostly ministry and family. And reading at night when kids are asleep, or that kind of thing.
Well, talk about Trinity Baptist. I mean, this seems like an opportunity that providentially opened up for you? It wasn't something that you were necessarily pursuing. Were you content to did you want to be an associate for a while and just, when did this start being an avenue for you?
Yeah, I had desired to be the main preaching pastor of a church for a long time. I had looked into a couple of opportunities that didn't pan out for a kind of senior pastor role. A friend recommended Chapel Hill as in need of more healthy evangelical churches, maybe a good fit for my personality and training, and could be a good fit for my family for a variety of reasons. And I just started asking around. I started talking to pretty like-minded local churches in the area, people that I knew in Chapel Hill and near Chapel Hill. And they recommended it. They said there's certainly a need. They said they thought it'd be a good fit. And then as we started kind of spreading the word or testing it out, there were just a number of very quality people, like an elder of CHBC that I had served with for several years who just recently moved to the area. Or people like that kind of already in place who could be really load bearing for a new work. And we're open to and eager to do that. And even a number of people who were willing to move down from Capitol Hill who had, ties to the area, maybe family nearby, or they'd gone to college there, or grew up in the region. And in this age of, some jobs are fully remote, that type of thing. They could either just move without much, a job being an issue or that type of thing. And getting the word out in some initial interest meetings. There was a good amount of interest. And so I think, we did kind of 9 months worth of occasional interest meetings. We as a family moved down in July. Some other CHBC families moved down even before we did, and even kind of started getting because some of the work started. They started a Sunday night prayer meeting as kind of an early core team thing, even before we moved down, which is delightful. Just showing this is the work of the saints, not just one person, not just a pastor,
right?
But they were running these prayer meetings and teaching and kind of having a preview of the church before we were even there, which is super sweet. One, it shows the caliber of people the Lord provided who would kind of get something up and running before the pastors even show up, which is just delightful.
You have to decide whether you want to join the church.
they have to decide whether they want me.
Yeah.
I was like, man, I think this thing's going to happen even if we don't move down. So we, long story short, we as a family moved in July. We had a series of kind of Sunday night prayer meetings, a series of core team meetings, and we wound up covenanting as a church with 50 members, adult members, and about 40 kids attached to those members. In September 29th of 2024. So we're about 8 months old as a church. We meet in an elementary school, technically in Durham, just over the line from Chapel Hill. We mainly have Durham and Chapel Hill folks, with some others scattered from the region. And the Lord's really blessed it. There's a sweet spirit in the congregation. There's unity. There's all kinds of people serving in all kinds of ways. A really joyful kind of presence in the congregation, people sharing the gospel, people inviting friends to church. And it really feels like a family. I think people have deeply invested in each other's lives quickly. And it feels like a more mature, established church than you would think it would 8 months in.
And so, it's all about the people. That's the heartbeat of it. Was this something that was CHBC seeking to plant a church in this area already?
No. CHBC mainly thinks about church planting regionally in the DC area in terms of maybe where are areas with not as much healthy churches, or where there are areas where there still might be maybe some pockets of CHBC members who kind of live in a clump and maybe could start something new. No, this was just a friend recommended it to me. I began praying about it and exploring it. Mark was open to kind of supporting it. The elders did give like an official thumbs up. It just is a matter of kind of counsel and accountability. But it was more of I'm looking for a way to be a senior pastor that's also going to serve my family and help maybe balance some challenges and burdens we have as a family. So it wasn't a CHBC idea, but it is supported by CHBC, sent some members, some financial support, prayer, encouragement.
Did you have a connection to North Carolina?
Not really.
Family-wise, not really?
Not really.
So this is a big move from
It's been a
DC.
It's been a big move, yeah.
But that's awesome. Well, that's also encouraging to hear, It's just like, to think some of your members were already kind of paving the way, and that they got it. They were like, we all have to buy into this for this to work is pretty exciting. Why don't we talk a little about your book?
Sure.
The title, Everything is Never Enough. Ecclesiastes Surprising Path to Resilient Happiness. So Ecclesiastes and happiness in the same sentence.
A little counterintuitive.
Yeah. You're not. Yeah. You're like, it's like, daily encouragement from Job. But obviously,
that's right.
What I really appreciate about this book is that I mean, that's the whole point. You kind of have to go through the valley of darkness a little bit to see the light.
Bingo.
And so, talk to me just on a personal level.
There was a delicate balancing act between me and my editor, especially in that first half.
Oh yeah,
especially in that first half. Book about happiness that is really unhappy for 60% of it. He had Drew Dixon, the editor at Waterbrook. I mean, there's several, but my editor at Waterbrook, he had the great idea that in each of those first chapters in part 1, I needed to have some type of let the light in moment of kind of what's the distilled lesson that flips in the positive. And he had to kind of persuade me into it. But once he did, by God's grace, I think I came up with some good material. And in retrospect, I was like, oh yeah, we really needed that. But sorry, what was the exact question you're going to ask?
No, I mean, I was curious, like, why did you decide to do, like, what drew you to Ecclesiastes personally, and that you would want to devote all this time to writing a book on it?
Yeah, Kohelet grabbed me by the lapels and wouldn't let me go. And I preached straight through the book during that COVID season. It was 2021. Our church was kind of displaced. We're meeting outside. We're meeting in these different venues. Everything is still kind of topsy-turvy. It's a big disruption in people's lives, including my own. I had planned to preach Ecclesiastes in 2020 before COVID was on the radar. I just
good planning.
Yeah, I just only got around to it in 2021. So it really grabbed a hold of me. It really had a deep impact on our congregation. And I had that experience of getting to the end of the book and just not wanting to let it go. I just wanted an excuse to hang out with Kohelet. I wanted to keep learning. This strangely compelling, dark, gloomy, but somehow sparkling and glittering kind of book. And, part of it, I think, was I'd lived long enough and experienced enough that some of the harder lessons really resonated. Part of it, too, is that I suppose some of my intellectual interests, I'm no expert, but a little bit more on the philosophy, cultural criticism, sociology. It kind of had me looking for dialogue partners to set into a conversation with Kohelet who could resonate meaningfully. And that challenge of trying to think, how do I bridge the gap to the modern world kind of intellectually and try to expound Ecclesiastes in a way that will evidently resonate with a lot of these modern issues. Kind of that challenge of bridging the gap kind of between two worlds also appealed to me. And I guess just the quest he goes on. I mean, it is such a strikingly modern book. He's on a quest for satisfaction. He's on a quest for fulfillment. He's on a quest for meaning. He's on a quest for happiness. And for so many people, I mean, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are inalienable rights according to our country's founding documents. And it just resonates intensely with what so many people go through and kind of the quests they're on. And the answers are so radical and shocking and demolishing and shattering. It was I don't know, I'm not giving you a great answer. It was kind of just like, I wanted to hang out with Ecclesiastes. I wanted to do whatever I could to sort of turn this into maybe an evangelistic tool. I guess I kind of saw an opportunity to bring the sort of topical order of the book together as well, in a way that some of it kind of crystallized for me right at the end of the preaching series. Some of it, frankly, even continued to crystallize in my study afterward. So I don't know. I just was looking for an excuse to keep Kohelet company.
Hey, that's a great reason. I mean, our church just did a series on Ecclesiastes as well, and it's exactly how you're describing it. There's something about how it just grips you with these interesting turns of phrases, some irony. But I do think what's interesting about your book is it's not just like a straight up commentary. I mean, you are interacting with some modern thinkers, some non-Christian thinkers, some secular, like just trying to get at the universal sort of ache that this world sort of brings. And I think that actually makes this a very unique kind of work. So one thing when we were studying Ecclesiastes was there is a lot of debate on how to understand this guy's outlook. I know Trimper Longman has a more pessimistic outlook.
That's right.
Other guys have a more optimistic outlook.
Preacher of joy, fundamentally optimistic.
Right. How did you work through those kinds of debates?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll do a little bit of the narrative of how my understanding developed. I think
Okay. Yeah.
I out of the sort of standard exegetical commentaries, I like Craig Bartholomew's Baker One the best. It's very thorough. It's very good. It's philosophically attuned. And I think one key insight that even comes from Bartholomew's PhD thesis is that Kohelet has these unmarked epistemological shifts where he's toggling between, he's shifting back and forth between an empirical mode and a confessional mode. In the empirical mode, he pronounces everything hevel, vanity, fleeting, meaningless, absurd. In the confessional mode, he pronounces everything a gift. And those are actually looking at the world through different lenses. And to detect that, you kind of just have to look at, wait a minute, this sounds like he's saying the opposite of what he said before. I think Bartholomew has this phrase, deliberate contradictory juxtaposition. And we know about deliberate contradictory juxtaposition from the Proverbs. Do not answer a fool according to his folly. Answer a fool according to his folly. Well, that deliberate contradictory juxtaposition is for the sake of training us in wisdom and to discern what makes it different situationally. I think Kohelet's deliberate contradictory juxtaposition is he is teaching us through it, but he's taking a different perspective. He's viewing the same stuff from a different vantage point. And so I think that kind of tensive polarity, that kind of holding these two things in tension, they sound opposite. They're not actually opposite. They're both true. They're true as seen from sort of different lenses or different points of view. One doesn't cancel the other out. The kind of two main themes, everything's absurd, everything's a gift. Seeing that those each have their own presence, their own integrity, their own contribution, kind of letting them each stand, I think is probably the most single influential interpretive decision you kind of have to make to get the book right. And I think even though I don't know that Bartholomew translates hevel as absurd exactly the way that I do, I think that key interpretive insight from Bartholomew is right, that there's an unmarked epistemological shift. And essentially, one simple way is you can say he's looking at all of life through the lens of the fall in one of those modes, and he's looking at all of life through the lens of creation in another one of those modes. So I think that, to me, that just has all kinds of explanatory power. And that's the biggest interpretive issue to resolve, which means you take negative Kohelet seriously. You take his judgments of absurd seriously. They're objectively true. They're the way the world is in this cursed fallen condition. You don't have to regard them as counsels of despair. You don't have to regard them as aberrant skeptical theology, as one well-known influential Reformed expositor who I almost cited in the book, but was, kind and charitable to not out that influential individual. I don't think it's aberrant skeptical theology. I think it's life. I think it's under the curse. You could get hit by a bus. You could be the world's most righteous person and get cancer at 28. You could be the most marriageable person in the world and never get married. You could get all the degrees in the world and never get hired. That's just this life in a fallen world. So I think you have to embrace Kohelet's negativity as an accurate reflection of the conditions of the curse. Now, at the same time, I don't think that the happy stuff, the positive stuff, the joy refrains are just their own kind of like, let us eat and drink for tomorrow we die. I don't think those are a counsel of despair. That's just kind of, whatever. If this is the best you can make of it, well, let's go party. I think they actually have their own kind of integrity and coherence as an ethic of gift, an ethic of receptivity, and an ethic of enjoyment. I think gift, reception, enjoyment all fit together. The theology of gift leads to an anthropology of reception and thankfulness and enjoyment. And there's a sort of anthropological correlate on either side of one of the things that makes our lives absurd is our kind of insatiable appetites and our misplaced quest for finding the greatest good, the sovereign good in things in this world. I think Ecclesiastes at least gets there by implication. And so by implication, one of the things that enables you to enjoy the world is actually disciplined desire, chastened desire, contentment, finding God to be your sovereign good and therefore able to enjoy earthly goods as a participation in his divine goodness. So I think there's a coherence to sort of each of those categories. And I do think there is an eternal horizon. That's another thing too. I think even in the body of the book, I think there's an eternal horizon of judgment, of transformation, of accountability. That I think Kohelet has a view of the afterlife. I think Kohelet has a view of a decisive act of God whereby the whole situation is changed and there's something restored out the other side. And that's a minority position among sort of more critical or academic scholars, but I think it's there. And so I think there's also an eternal perspective in the book. And so the biggest issue is getting the skeptical, negative, dark stuff and just saying, yeah, that's true of the fall. The positive, joyful gift stuff and saying, oh, he's seeing it that way because he's looking at life through the lens of God's gift. And that there really is even an eternal horizon where these wrongs are going to be righted. That putting all three of those together gradually dawned on me and became the structure.
This made me think about kind of how the Beatitudes are structured, where there's this eschatological horizon that kind of goes into the present,
Totally.
you know? And so where these, like, how can those who thirst for righteousness be satisfied? Like, how can the poor, like, how does that work together? And that's what struck me, reading through your book and then doing this series ourselves, was that eschatological horizon that's so latent in the book.
Yeah, it only pokes through a couple times.
Yeah.
But I think the predominant question he's answering, what is good for man to enjoy the few days of his vain life? I do think the primary answer to what is good is his ethic of gift and enjoyment. Toil, contentment, enjoy the wife of your youth, eat your bread with joy. There is a primarily this worldly answer to the question of what is good. But I do think the eternal horizon is significant. Like when he says, for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. And so I think it functions more implicitly. It's not so much of a concrete answer, but it makes you ask, wait a minute, if nothing in this life will last, if nothing in this life is ultimately satisfying, if we do have these limited good gifts, but this craving in our hearts for eternity, Ecclesiastes 3:11, it's kind of the implicit sort of syllogism of the whole book is only filled out by there is an eternal horizon. There is a coming new world. You can't get everything from this life. You can get some good things if you learn to enjoy them rightly. There is this yearning that remains. And there's these glimpses of how to be fulfilled.
Right. Okay. So it's more of a background kind of thing that's working there, but it's you're sort of being prompted further. You mentioned the idea of self-control and self-restraint as actually a key to enjoyment, which, I mean, and that kind of gives some color to really the end of the book. He's like, the end of the matter is, fear God,
right.
But there is that fear of God that does restrain us from unbridled, pursuit of our kind of fleshly desires or whatever, those kinds of things. So it's kind of interesting how that kind of, because when I first read Ecclesiastes many years ago, I'm like, that's it. That's the answer. It's like you die and then you face judgment and, but maybe tease that out a little bit, that idea of restraint and enjoyment.
Yeah. So I do think one of the causes of absurdity for Ecclesiastes, and I'm using absurd in kind of a technical way to mean there's a expectation that's not met. There's a desire or feeling that something is right that the world doesn't actually provide. One of the causes of absurdity is our insatiable desire. So like Ecclesiastes 5:10, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is absurd. Okay, what is the love of money? Well, as Ecclesiastes defines it, and as the Bible mainly talks about it, it's a disordered desire. Love of money meaning you want it more and more. You have a craving for it. You have an inordinate appetite for it. So there's a condemnation of an inordinate desire for wealth. But then what about this? 8 verses later, Ecclesiastes 5:19. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice in his toil, this is the gift of God. Now that's interesting. Wealth there is a blessing. It's a gift. Now there has to also be a God-given power to enjoy them. Okay, so there has to be some divinely given subjective element that enables us to receive it rightly, leading to enjoyment. And so Ecclesiastes doesn't specify exactly what the content of that divine donation is. But I think by implication, if part of the problem is a disordered desire leading you to cry more, 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 that accept his lot, I guess by implication too, accept his lot is accept limits. Accept his lot is this much and no more. Accept his lot is okay. God's given me this. This is what I have to work with. This is what I have to enjoy. I think that language of lot is part of how the sense of restraint comes in. That only by, Jeremiah Burroughs, Rare Jewel of Christian Contentment, only by bringing my heart down, as it were, to the size of my lot, can I enjoy that lot. Here's the shape of the lot. This wife, these kids, this job. Yeah, God might change things. There might be different things happening in the church, but whatever this lot is, this is the shape of what God's given me. I can only properly enjoy it if I can learn to limit my desires to it. I think that's part of the kind of logic of piecing together the sort of journey from the negative condemnation, especially of excessive desires, and then the positive enjoyment of that very thing.
It's almost like a trope. People, of course, money's not going to make you happy, all these things, but we don't functionally believe that. But that is something that, that insatiable desire, it is something that constantly haunts us. What do you think about, you read through Ecclesiastes, you're like, man, you could read, a Stoic who's a secular guy, he could read a big, absolutely, that's some good stuff. Or, Jordan Peterson could read, do a whole series on Ecclesiastes. And what is uniquely Christian about it? Or what is uniquely, I guess, I don't know, if I can better term, what that brings it beyond just
the kind of secular
what you would hear from a Stoic book.
What makes it more than Stoic, better than Stoic? Yeah. Well, that's where I do think that there is a real assertion, metaphysical, ontological, worldview assertion. The story we're living in is that enjoyment of life is a gift of God. And so gift as a doctrine of creation, all of creation is a gift. Every life is a gift. Every good thing to enjoy in your life is a gift. And taking that with utmost seriousness, it's from God. He didn't have to make it. He freely chose to make it. It was an overflow of joy and goodness, and the sort of classical doctrine of the diffusive or communicative property of goodness, that there's an intrinsic impulse to share, to spread. I think that's implicit in Ecclesiastes in the sense that if all of life is a gift, it's because God, that reflects the very nature of God as a good and overflowing giver. And so I think the 7 sort of joy manifesto passages, often called, Carpe Diem passages, 2:24-26, 3:12-13, 5:18-20, and so on. I think when you line all those up, as I kind of do in the second part of the book, I think the doctrine of creation leads you to understand all of life is a gift. And that's not a kind of pious, nice sounding, it's just such a gift to be here, and you kind of use it as a metaphor. No. That's like the deepest down truth of reality. This didn't have to be here. God wanted it here. I didn't have to be here. God wanted me here. How do I know God loves me? Because he made me. So there's a even with, frankly, there's a kind of realism where even in the brightest passages, they're tinged with absurdity. Like the one in chapter 9 on marriage, 9:9. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love, all the days of your absurd life that he's given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. So even in this very happy verse about marriage, there's absurdity and there's twofold toil. Like it's gonna be hard work. It makes. I already do preach maybe slightly darker wedding sermons, but like this is a kind of dark wedding sermon. When I do application to the bride and groom, I get to you guys are embarking on a lot of work. You guys are also writing a blank check where you don't know where the cost is going to come due. And so I think even Ecclesiastes, this sense that all of life is a gift, even those gifts are tinged with absurdity. They're tinged with difficulty, darkness, hardship, loss, work, toil, yet they remain good gifts. I think in a sense that realism is part of, it was the publisher's idea, but it's a good word. That realism is part of what makes this a resilient happiness. That these good gifts, they can be tinged with the absurd. They can be tinged with loss, but they remain good. There's a deep down goodness that is in the thing itself. That is a matter of metaphysical goodness, to invoke kind of a classical, Thomistic category. Creation is metaphysically good. It is good that it exists. That's something that a Jordan Peterson mythologizing Jungian archetypes cannot get you.
Yeah, because all you can really get through is sort of a psychological framing, but
Bingo.
it's in your head.
Bingo.
It's not actually inherent in the world.
It's out there. Ecclesiastes is saying the goodness is out there.
Right. And I think that's you interact with a lot of modern thinkers and writers, and I think one of the hard things is that it's hard to escape in our modern world this idea that it's just stuff out there, and we have
our minds kind of make it what it is. We tool
it's all just a mind game, as opposed to this vision of what you're talking about, this resiliency and the thickness of the reality that is objective to us. It actually is good, and we can press into reality and see that.
Like 11:7, light is sweet and it is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. There's beautiful dappled sunlight in my backyard right now. I can see it filtering through the trees. I can see it falling on our garden. It's sweet. There's this objective good character ascribed to this universal feature of existence. Light is sweet. It is good for the sun to be shining. There is goodness streaming at me. And yes, it's a nuclear fission reaction, blah, 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 blah. But you don't reduce it to that. Don't fall into a kind of biological, naturalistic, physicalist reductionism. God made it. God is the one making the sunshine. It's good. It's sweet.
Right.
It's pleasant.
And he wants you to enjoy it, which I think that's, it's almost like you read it and it's kind of like, it's okay. And what's so sobering in a good way about Ecclesiastes, it's like you have a Holy Spirit inspired book that's like, this is not pie in the sky. Like, I get what life is like, especially toward the end when it talks to the aging process and like in very graphic terms and approaching death and the vanishing kind of vapor of your youth and all these type of things. It's it's not like God understands exactly the pains and the trials of life.
Yeah.
And yet you can still enjoy those fleeting little moments because in fact, they're there for you to enjoy.
Yes. And that, I do think, and this is where I kind of pick a fight with Hartmut Rosa, who I otherwise draw on so much and agree with so much and benefit from so much. Rosa's concept of resonance is very much kind of about moments. And I agree with a lot of it. But I think Ecclesiastes kind of goes one better because even about like rejoicing in toil, there's something sort of durable. There's something renewable. If you can learn to rejoice in toil, that's a sort of regular, sustained source of enjoyment.
Yeah, that's the resilience.
Exactly. That's the resilience. Yeah, precisely. And so I think there's genuinely, I think one metaphor I deploy in the book is kind of like, going deeper in to the thing right in front of you. There's the classical Jeremiah. How do you get happy? Well, there's the classic Jeremiah Burroughs, get your heart down to the level of your circumstances, which is necessary. And Ecclesiastes talks about that or implies it. But there's also go deeper in, open your eyes wider to the thing in front of you, which I think is part of Ecclesiastes' ethic.
Yeah, I mean, that's in some ways that's sort of the most offensive part of the book, where it's telling you to settle in a sense. Like the Burroughs kind of, but it's not this sort of total denigration of life. It's actually the window into which you can finally see what's in front of you.
Exactly. And, Ecclesiastes, it has this haunting statement in chapter 6, 6:9, better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of the appetite. This also is vanity and a striving after wind. So it actually, I think Ecclesiastes uses sight as a metaphor for consumption, a metaphor for enjoyment, kind of sight as enjoyment. Okay, so if the thing you want is in front of you, there's two options. You can enjoy it for whatever it's worth, or your appetite can wander away from it, even when it's there for you to have. So in other words, I think Ecclesiastes is using sight to mean enjoyable, licit consumption. But you could, instead of having an enjoyable, licit consumption, your heart could wander away and you could think, oh, I wish this was different, or I want this, or what time is the game on, or I wonder what so-and-so is doing, or this isn't as good as last week when there was a different chef here, or whatever it might be. And that's kind of the haunting thing. There is a certain alignment of your heart with what's in front of you that has to happen in order for there to be any enjoyment.
I remember one of my friends, he's a little boy who is just like, this is when he was like 2 or 3, and he had his first lollipop. He's like enjoying it. It's like amazing. And then like I look away and then I hear him he's sobbing. I'm like, what happened? And all he's saying is, make it come back. Because he didn't realize that the lollipop
goes away.
The more he enjoys it, the more bad. And I'm like, we're all that kid. We're all that kid. You know?
That's a great illustration. Make it come back.
I know. But I think that it is, there is something very profound about how Ecclesiastes frames those things, and even using a concept like absurdity and really making you, like, I always think about it, it just forces you to contend with these things that you really don't want to think through.
And, I think it's like I quote, I think it was somebody commenting on the poetry of T.S. Eliot saying something like the bald statement of a sobering truth has its own kind of cleansing power, something like that. And I think there is something refreshing. Like you clear away the idolatrous attachment and you're better able to enjoy it.
Yeah.
And even just the clearing away the idolatrous attachment, you kind of go, oh, there is something here for me.
Right.
You can enjoy the lollipop for what it's worth, eat the ice cream down to the bottom of the cone and be thankful.
Yeah. Now, how is this, as you're pastoring people, even as you're counseling people, have you seen Ecclesiastes kind of work its way into how you're approaching people in suffering, people in difficult times?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, maybe especially as a kind of sobering wake-up call for the type of narratives or the kind of expectation of a life going sort of up and to the right. If you're young, if you're upwardly mobile, if DC, Chapel Hill, both pretty kind of privileged places, a lot of education, a lot of opportunity. If you're especially the kind of person where life looks like it should be opening up ahead of you, Ecclesiastes can be really helpful for reframing expectations, for helping you discover those things that you're sort of counting on or think you can control or think you can guarantee. In a nutshell, I think as an antidote to the idolatry of control, or an antidote to a control-based way of trying to relate to the world, I think that, especially ministering to people under 40, which was a lot of people in our congregation in DC. It's a lot of people in our small little church in Chapel Hill. That's maybe, if I try to kind of boil it down, that's maybe where I think I've seen the biggest payoff. And I think I've seen people be encouraged and refreshed and kind of liberated by that message.
Well, again, it's kind of like that Eliot quote about the cleansing power of that just kind of the boldness of the truth. And I think it's made more difficult with technology where it's, I even feel with myself, you're just like, you really can control everything. I mean, there's this like sort of, it's ingrained. And it makes me wonder, how do you, spiritual formation is all the rage. Everyone's talking about that, the ways that we're shaped and formed. How does Ecclesiastes on the ground level work its way? Like, how do we start to, from the ground level, reframe the way that we engage the world so we can do what you're saying as press in deeper? More than just like, okay, we have the right thoughts now. Like, what are some ways that you've seen that work well?
Oh, it's a great question. And do you mean Ecclesiastes especially inspiring it, or do you mean general pastoral strategies for getting out of the sort of technological illusion of control?
I think maybe a little bit of both. I mean, just thinking like you have this idea of you want to receive everything as a gift, and you want to have this vision of creation as a gift and to embrace it and not to have your heart wander off. But how does that actually take on practical, what does that look like on the ground to habituate yourself to view the world in that kind of way?
That's a good question. I want to think for just a second. It might not make for great podcast or radio.
Nah, that's no worries.
I think maybe if I were to give a general strategy, I do think various forms of outright opting out and unplugging, whether that is from social media altogether, or whether that's a form of a regular technology fast, or whether it's finding ways to set firm limits either to work or kind of digitally mediated interaction or kind of social connectivity. I think finding ways to restrain the scope of your attention and what you are available to, and be able to more focus it in on the concrete persons, tasks, places, etc. I'm increasingly a kind of techno pessimist, tending toward like full blown Wendell-Berry. People would say Luddite, Luddite, blah blah blah. I would say people who discern the cultural ecology shaping element of every single technology, and that every augmentation of a human ability is also an amputation of a human ability. But this is not a podcast about technology. Maybe I'll eventually write a book someday. But yeah, I think honestly, kind of learning more like manual ways of being present, whether that's face-to-face conversation, whether that's manual work, whether that's walking or biking, not driving. I do think we are so tempted to a kind of, like Ross Douthat had a really interesting recent piece about kind of synthetic substitutions. Why is there the birth dearth? Why is there the coming population implosion? He kind of analyzed our entire culture as one of providing synthetic, technologically enabled substitutes for sort of core human goods and practices. And so I think in a way, practices that help us to relearn what it means to be human in our embodiment, in our limitations. I do think there's a necessarily embodied element of learning to receive the sort of concrete goods of creation as a gift, because we're so used to a thickly mediated world we live in, from the built environment to means of communication. Andy Crouch's stuff is good on this. Like his book, The Life We're Looking For. Isn't that what it's called? Yeah, The Life We're Looking For. I think Andy Crouch is really good on a kind of big picture of re-embodying ourselves as what he calls a heart, soul, mind, strength complexes designed for love of God and neighbor. That there are, and I wouldn't want to be overly prescriptive. I think different people can do it in different ways, but there's a necessarily embodied practical element that is sort of engaging more of your humanity, either unmediated by technology or with minimal technological kind of input or interference, is gonna help.
Everyone just wants to live with Wendell-Berry. I feel like he's the guy that,
Well, just to be quite frank, I started seriously reading Wendell-Berry. I've read some of his stuff, but the kind of meta critique of modernity that people like Hartmut Rosa were offering, that I was putting into dialogue with Ecclesiastes, led me to approach Berry kind of with an open mind, and to recognize the questions he's asking. I think more people should be asking them, and the answers he's giving, I think a lot of them hold a lot of water.
I read Hannah Coulter, I think last year, and it's just, I think there's a little bit of romanticism of kind of that like small country life, but there is something about it. You read it and you're like, this. One thing is just like you're talking about embracing our humanness, and when you think about limitations, I'm thinking about like inconveniences, like that inconvenience is part of life. Inconvenience is the actual concrete manifestation of like our finitude.
Yeah.
And we have such an ability to remove any inconvenience that I think it detaches us from that reminder constantly of having to wait for things, of having to wait for seasons, of having to wait on the weather, all these types of things that kind of situate us in this posture of dependence that we can kind of totally bypass, because of technology and the ways that we can control our environments. And we just all got a homestead. You know what I mean? That's the key. Bobby, thank you so much for this interview. I appreciate it. And it's a great book. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. Make sure you pick up a copy. I think it'll be really helpful. It's great for a small group. It's great just for your own reading. And I think it's going to be something that will be a surprising path to resilient happiness for many.
Sure.
So, Bobby, thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely. Good to talk, brother.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you liked it, please support the show and consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can find all the links to our YouTube channel and our Instagram account in the show notes. Thank you guys for joining us.